In a city that never sleeps, where chaos often overshadows connection, Officer Emily Carter finds herself at the center of an incident that changes everything. One fateful night, a routine stop at a corner store turns into a confrontation that shakes her identity as a law enforcement officer and her trust in the system she's dedicated her life to. Wrongfully arrested by one of her own, Emily's journey is one of resilience and transformation. What begins as a personal fight for justice quickly becomes something much bigger, a call to bridge the widening gap between the badge and the community it serves. Along the way, Emily encounters unexpected allies, faces fierce resistance, and grapples with her own doubts, all while striving to make a difference in a system resistant to change. But can one person truly ignite a revolution of understanding and trust? And how far will Emily go to prove that even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to something greater? The city never sleeps, and neither does Emily Carter, or at least it feels that way most nights. At 34, she was a seasoned officer with the New York Police Department, someone her colleagues often looked to for calm in chaos. But on this particular Tuesday night, calm was the last thing on her mind. It was almost midnight, and Emily was finally off duty after a grueling 12-hour shift. She felt the exhaustion in her bones as she parked her car in the dimly lit lot of a corner store on 45th Street. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, but the fridge at home was empty, and she was too tired to care about the flickering streetlights that gave the lot a horror movie vibe. She grabbed her wallet and stepped out of her car, hoping to grab a bottle of water and maybe something to snack on before collapsing into bed. That was when she noticed the scene a few feet away. A group of teenagers, no older than 16 or 17, stood frozen in the parking lot as a white police officer barked at them, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. Emily's instincts kicked in. She had been on the force long enough to know the difference between a routine interaction and one about to spiral out of control. This felt like the latter. The officer's voice cut through the night. "Hands out of your pockets now." The kids hesitated, their wide eyes filled with fear. They wore basketball jerseys and hoodies, their sneakers scuffed from what was likely a game in the park. They were just kids. Emily knew it, and her gut twisted at the power imbalance in front of her. "This is not my business," she told herself. "I am off duty. Let it go." But as she watched the teenagers freeze under the officer's glare, something in her rebelled. She had spent years on the force trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, and walking away now felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. She approached, keeping her hands visible, her voice steady. "Officer, is everything all right here?" The cop turned toward her, startled. His eyes raked over her appearance, sweats, sneakers, and a hoodie that said, "Not mad, just done." She could see the judgment in his eyes before he even spoke. "Step back, ma'am," he barked, waving her off as if she were a nosy bystander. Emily raised her hands slightly. "I am an officer too," she said, her badge tucked safely in her back pocket. "I just want to make sure everyone is okay." The officer's expression hardened. "Do not move. Hands on the car now." For a moment, Emily thought she had misheard him. Then, before she could process what was happening, the officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back and slamming her against the hood of his squad car. The cold metal bit into her cheek as the breath left her lungs. She could hear the teenagers shouting in the background, their voices a mix of anger and fear. "This is a mistake," Emily managed, her voice strained. "My badge is in my pocket." "Save it," the officer snapped. "You can explain yourself at the station." The ride to the precinct felt surreal. Emily sat in the back of the squad car, staring at the partition as anger and disbelief churned inside her. By the time they arrived, her patience was thinner than paper. She barely registered the whispers that rippled through the precinct as Officer Jack Daniels marched her inside, his chest puffed with misplaced pride. "Emily, what the hell?" The desk sergeant's voice broke the tension as he stared at her in shock. Caught her interfering in an active situation, Daniels declared, as if he were delivering a report on a dangerous fugitive. Refused to comply. The sergeant's face turned pale. Daniels, she is a senior officer. Daniels froze, his confidence deflating. What? Emily let out a dry laugh, her cheek still stinging from the car hood. Told you, the sergeant sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Daniels, get her out of those cuffs. Now. The next morning, Emily's phone buzzed nonstop. The video of her arrest, taken by one of the teenagers, had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage, and the hashtags Emily Carter and racial profiling trended for hours. But Emily was not interested in online sympathy. What she wanted was accountability. When she walked into the precinct that morning, every eye followed her. Some of her colleagues offered awkward smiles, while others looked away. Tom Miller, her partner of 3 years, rushed to her side. Emily, what the hell happened last night? Your boy Daniels decided I was a threat, she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. And now I am making sure Internal Affairs hears about it. Tom winced. Are you sure you want to go through with this? It will get messy. Messy, she echoed, her voice low but firm. Tom, this is not just about me. It is about every person who has been treated like they do not belong, even when they have earned their place. Tom nodded, though the worry in his eyes was hard to miss. Emily knew she was walking into a storm, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. This storm was long overdue. The fallout from that night hit Emily Carter like a tidal wave. By the time she returned home after filing her formal complaint with Internal Affairs, she was emotionally drained. Her small apartment, with its mismatched furniture and faint scent of lavender from an old diffuser, offered little comfort. She sank into her worn-out couch and stared at the flickering light from the TV she had forgotten to turn off. The headlines were everywhere. Decorated NYPD officer arrested in racial profiling incident. Viral video sparks outrage. The hashtags continued to trend, with posts dissecting every second of the video. Some people applauded Emily's courage, while others accused her of overreacting. Emily scrolled through the comments, feeling a strange mix of validation and frustration. The support was heartening, but the backlash stung in ways she had not anticipated. Her phone buzzed with another notification. It was Tom Miller. For a moment she debated letting it go to voicemail, but she sighed and answered. Emily. Tom's voice was hesitant. I just wanted to check on you. I'm fine, she said, though the crack in her voice betrayed her. Tom hesitated. Look, I know it's a lot, but people are talking. The whole precinct is buzzing about this. Daniels is, well, let's just say he's not taking it well. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Not taking it well. He cuffed me, dragged me to the precinct, and humiliated me in front of half the city. But sure, let's worry about his feelings. That's not what I meant, Tom said quickly. I just think you should be ready. Not everyone's on your side here. Yeah, I got that, Emily replied. But I didn't do this to win a popularity contest. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Tom was quiet for a moment. I've got your back, Emily. Just take care of yourself, okay? After hanging up, Emily leaned back and closed her eyes. The exhaustion was bone deep, but her mind refused to rest. She thought about the kids in the parking lot, their terrified faces, and the way Daniels had treated them like threats rather than teenagers. That could have been anyone. It could have been her, long before she wore a badge. The next morning, walking into the precinct felt like stepping into a minefield. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she passed, and the weight of judgmental stares settled on her shoulders. Emily kept her head high, but the tension was suffocating. Daniels was at his desk, his face flushed with irritation. His usual smug grin was gone, replaced by a scowl. He avoided eye contact as she walked by, but Emily could feel his resentment radiating like heat from a fire. You're just making it worse for everyone, someone muttered near the lockers. Emily paused, turning to see two officers whispering to each other. "I'm sorry. What was that?" she said, her voice calm but firm. The younger of the two officers flushed red. "Nothing. Just, it's a lot of drama, you know, and not all of us want to be dragged into it." Emily folded her arms. "Right. Because calling out injustice is such an inconvenience for you." The older officer tried to defuse the tension. "Look, we're just saying Daniel's made a mistake. Maybe it's not worth blowing this up." Emily's laugh was sharp. "A mistake? He saw me, assumed I didn't belong, and arrested me without a second thought. That's not a mistake, it's a pattern. And if you think staying quiet makes you neutral, it doesn't. It makes you complicit." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before walking away. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. The truth was, the confrontation had rattled her, but she wasn't going to let it show. Later that day, as she sat at her desk, Internal Affairs called. Emily recognized the name on the caller ID, Sofia Rivera. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and her reputation for fairness was the only thing that gave Emily a sliver of confidence. "Officer Carter," Rivera began, her voice brisk, "I've reviewed the video and your complaint. I'd like to schedule an interview to go over the details." "Of course," Emily said. "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. Bring any additional documentation you have. And Officer Carter, I want you to be prepared. This isn't going to be easy." Emily hung up and stared at her phone. The weight of the situation felt heavier than ever, but there was no turning back now. She had started this fight, and she would see it through. The next day, the meeting with Rivera was tense but productive. The investigator was sharp and thorough, asking detailed questions about the incident. Emily recounted every moment, from the flickering parking lot lights to the cold metal of the squad car's hood against her cheek. When she finished, Rivera leaned back in her chair, studying Emily carefully. "This is bad," she said, "for Daniels, for the department, but especially for you. You're going to face pushback, not just from him, but from others who see this as a betrayal." "I didn't sign up to protect feelings," Emily said. "I signed up to protect people." Rivera nodded, a faint smile breaking through her professional demeanor. "Good answer. You've got a tough road ahead, but if you stick with it, you might actually make a difference." As Emily left the office, she felt a strange mix of emotions. The path she had chosen was fraught with challenges, but Rivera's unexpected kindness had planted a seed of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this as she had thought. Back at the precinct, things remained tense. Daniels avoided her, and the whispers behind her back persisted. But something shifted that evening when she stopped by a coffee shop on her way home. A man in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, approached her. "Officer Carter?" he asked. "Yes," she said cautiously. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "I saw the video. What you did? It matters. It's not just about that one night. It's about all of us who've been in those kids' shoes." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I was just doing what anyone should do." The man smiled. "Maybe, but not everyone does. Keep fighting the good fight, officer." As he walked away, Emily stood there, holding her coffee and feeling an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. The battle ahead was still daunting, but moments like these reminded her why she had started it in the first place. The precinct buzzed with the low hum of activity, phones ringing and conversations blending into white noise. Emily Carter walked through the familiar space, feeling every set of eyes on her back. The support she had received from strangers online was heartening, but it didn't make her daily reality any easier. Here, where her badge should have meant solidarity, she felt like an outsider. She reached her desk and sat down, pretending not to notice the pointed stares from across the room. Tom Miller, her partner, sidled up, coffee in hand. "You're holding up?" he asked, his voice low. Emily offered a weak smile. "Surviving." Tom nodded. I spoke to Rivera this morning. She said your interview went well. Yeah, Emily replied, leaning back in her chair. She's sharp, tough, but fair. Tom hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. You've got some quiet supporters here, you know. Not everyone is against you. Emily raised an eyebrow, quiet being the operative word. Tom sighed. Look, you know how it is. People are scared. They don't want to rock the boat. Funny how that works, Emily said, her tone sharper than she intended. I didn't think doing the right thing was supposed to feel like mutiny. Tom didn't argue. Instead, he placed the coffee on her desk and walked away, leaving Emily to her thoughts. By the time her shift ended, she was emotionally spent. She left the precinct quickly, eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Outside, the air was cool, and the streets bustled with their usual chaos. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. Rivera, just got another witness statement. We need to talk tomorrow. I think this might help your case. Emily tucked her phone back into her pocket, a small flicker of hope igniting in her chest. As she started the car, she thought about the man from the coffee shop the night before, the way he had thanked her, the quiet sincerity in his voice. It was a small moment, but it had stayed with her. The next afternoon, Emily met Rivera in her office. The investigator's expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was a glint of determination in her eyes. We got a statement from one of the teenagers, Rivera said, sliding a paper across the desk. It corroborates your account. His mother brought him in this morning. She wanted to thank you personally, but I told her that would have to wait. Emily picked up the paper, scanning the statement. The teenager, Marcus Johnson, had described the fear he felt that night, how he froze when Daniels shouted, how he had thought things would escalate if Emily hadn't intervened. This is solid, Rivera said. It shows you were acting to de-escalate the situation, not interfere. Good, Emily said. But what about Daniels? Has he said anything? Rivera's expression darkened. He's sticking to his story for now. But trust me, the more evidence we pile up, the harder it will be for him to wiggle out of this. Emily nodded, a small wave of relief washing over her. For the first time since the incident, she felt like things might tilt in her favor. Later that evening, Emily stopped by the youth center where Marcus and his friends often hung out. She hadn't been there in years, not since her early days on the force when she used to volunteer. The place was exactly as she remembered: bright murals on the walls, the sound of basketballs echoing from the gym, and the smell of pizza wafting from somewhere. As she walked inside, a voice called out, "Officer Carter?" Emily turned to see a man approaching, his smile warm and familiar. It was Marcus Hayes, a retired firefighter who had run the youth center for as long as she could remember. "Marcus," she said, smiling despite herself. "It's been a while." "Too long," he said, clasping her hand. "I saw the video. You've been through it, huh?" Emily sighed. "That's one way to put it." "Come on," Marcus said, leading her to a small office at the back. "Let's talk." The office was cluttered but cozy, with framed photos of past events and thank-you notes from kids who had come through the center. Marcus sat behind his desk, gesturing for Emily to take a seat. "You know," he said, leaning forward, "I've seen a lot of good officers come through here, trying to make a difference. But what you did the other night, that takes courage." Emily shook her head. "I don't feel brave. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." "That's exactly what makes you brave," Marcus said. "And that's why I wanted to talk to you. You've got people watching you now, Emily, kids, families, people who've been through what those teenagers went through. They're looking to you to prove that change is possible." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "I don't know if I can live up to that." Marcus smiled. "You already are, but you don't have to do it alone. I've got some connections in the community, people who've been pushing for change for years. I think you should meet them." Emily hesitated. The idea of stepping further into the spotlight was daunting, But Marcus's words resonated with her. She had always believed in the power of community, and maybe this was her chance to put that belief into action. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus introduced her to activists, community leaders, and even a few retired officers who shared her vision for change. The conversations were eye-opening, forcing Emily to confront the flaws in the system she had dedicated her life to. But they also filled her with hope. For every story of injustice, there was a story of resilience, of people coming together to make things better. Through it all, Marcus remained a steady presence, offering advice and encouragement. His unexpected kindness had been a turning point for Emily, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Back at the precinct, the tension was still palpable, but Emily noticed small shifts. A few officers who had previously avoided her now offered nods of acknowledgement. Even Daniels seemed less defiant, though he still refused to apologize outright. One afternoon, as Emily was leaving a meeting with Rivera, Tom caught up with her. "Hey," he said, a little out of breath. "I heard you've been meeting with some community folks. That's great." "Thanks," Emily said, surprised. "Why the sudden interest?" Tom shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe you're rubbing off on me." Emily smiled. It was a small moment, but it felt like progress. As she drove home that night, Emily thought about everything that had happened since that night in the parking lot. The challenges had been overwhelming at times, but the kindness of people like Marcus and the teenager's courage had kept her going. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the system she was fighting to change. The youth center buzzed with activity, laughter and conversation echoing through the hallways as kids played basketball and worked on homework in the study rooms. For Emily Carter, it was becoming a second home. Over the past few weeks, Marcus Hayes had introduced her to community leaders, activists, and even local business owners who shared her vision of bridging the gap between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. But today, Emily was here for another reason. Marcus had asked her to speak at an informal gathering of parents and teens, sharing her experiences as an officer and answering questions about her role in the community. It wasn't the kind of thing Emily was used to, but she couldn't say no to Marcus. The room filled quickly, the crowd spilling out into the hallway. Emily scanned the faces, noticing a mix of curiosity and cautious skepticism. She cleared her throat and stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "I'm Officer Emily Carter," she began, "and I know trust between law enforcement and the community can feel like a distant dream. I've seen it break down firsthand, but I've also seen how it can be rebuilt, one conversation at a time." As Emily spoke, the initial tension in the room began to ease. She shared her story of the incident with Officer Daniels, the fear she felt that night, and her determination to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. She was honest about her frustrations with the system, but she also spoke of hope, of the small changes she had already seen. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. A young girl raised her hand, her voice trembling with emotion as she asked, "How do you keep going when it feels like nothing will change?" Emily paused, the weight of the question settling over her. "Because change isn't about overnight victories," she said. "It's about the small steps, the conversations, the people who stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' It's about all of us, together." After the event, Emily lingered, talking to parents and teenagers who approached her with questions and stories of their own. She was gathering her things when Marcus walked up, a knowing smile on his face. "You've got a knack for this," he said. Emily shook her head, laughing softly. "I'm just trying to figure it out as I go." Marcus patted her shoulder. "That's all any of us are doing. But you're making a difference, Emily. Don't forget that." As she left the youth center, Emily felt lighter than she had in weeks. The doubts that had haunted her since the incident seemed quieter, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. The next day, Emily was driving home from the precinct when she spotted a commotion on the sidewalk. A small group had gathered around an elderly man who appeared to have collapsed, his groceries scattered across the pavement. Without hesitation, Emily pulled over and rushed to help. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, kneeling beside him. The man looked up, his face pale and lined with worry. "I think I just got dizzy," he murmured. "It's nothing." But Emily wasn't convinced. She checked his pulse and gently helped him sit up. "Let's get you some water," she said. A woman from the crowd handed her a bottle, and Emily held it out to the man. As he sipped, Emily asked, "Do you have anyone nearby who can help you? Family or a neighbor?" The man shook his head. "Just me," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. Emily glanced at the spilled groceries, noticing a few cans of soup and a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it told her enough. She offered him a kind smile. "Let's get you home," she said. "I'll help." The man hesitated, but eventually nodded. With the help of a bystander, Emily got him to his feet and walked him to a small apartment building a few blocks away. The inside of his unit was tidy but sparse, with little more than a recliner and a small TV. A framed photo on the table caught Emily's eye, a younger version of the man standing with a woman who looked like she could light up a room with her smile. "Thank you," he said, easing into his chair. "Most people wouldn't stop. You're a good one." Emily felt a pang in her chest. "It's no trouble," she said, "but you need to take care of yourself. If you ever need help, call someone. Call me, even." The man smiled faintly. "I'll be okay. Just need to rest." As Emily left, she couldn't shake the encounter. It reminded her of why she had joined the force in the first place: to serve, to protect, to help those who needed it most. Somewhere along the way, that purpose had gotten tangled in bureaucracy and politics. But moments like these brought it back into focus. That evening, Emily shared the story with Marcus, who listened intently as they sat in his office at the youth center. "You've got a good heart, Emily," Marcus said. "That's what sets you apart. People see that, even if they don't say it." Emily shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You did what you would do, and that's what makes all the difference." As they talked, Marcus suggested an idea that caught Emily by surprise: a community outreach program that would pair officers with local leaders to address concerns and build trust. It was ambitious, but the more they discussed it, the more Emily saw its potential. "We'll need the precinct's support," she said. "And that's not going to be easy." Marcus grinned. "Good thing you've never been afraid of a challenge." The next week, Emily presented the idea to her captain and a handful of colleagues. The reaction was mixed. Some were intrigued, others skeptical. But to her surprise, Tom spoke up in her defense. "Emily's right," he said. "We need to do better, and this could be a start." The captain agreed to give it a trial run, and Emily felt a spark of hope. Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly with Marcus and other community leaders to plan the program. They called it Bridge the Gap, and its first event, a neighborhood cleanup, was set for the following weekend. When the day arrived, Emily was nervous. She wasn't sure how many people would show up or how the officers would be received. But as the event got underway, she was overwhelmed by the turnout. Officers worked side by side with residents, sharing stories and laughs as they picked up trash and painted over graffiti. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. As the day ended, she stood with Marcus, watching the crowd disperse. "You did good," Marcus said. "This is just the beginning." Emily nodded, her heart full. "Yeah," she said softly. "It is." The success of the first Bridge the Gap event gave Emily Carter a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. The turnout had been larger than anyone anticipated, with officers and residents working side by side in ways that felt genuine and unforced. For a moment, It seemed as though the walls that divided them had started to crumble, but Emily knew better than to celebrate too soon. Change, real change, was slow and often met with resistance. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was cautiously optimistic. A few of her colleagues even stopped by her desk to offer quiet words of encouragement. Tom Miller, ever the reliable partner, was the first to acknowledge her efforts. "That cleanup event was something else," he said, leaning against her desk. Even Daniels looked like he was enjoying himself. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Daniels was there?" Tom nodded. "Yeah. He stayed in the background, but he showed up. That's got to count for something, right?" Emily wasn't so sure. Daniels had been avoiding her ever since Internal Affairs began their investigation, and his presence at the event felt more like damage control than genuine participation. Still, the fact that he was there at all was a small step in the right direction. "Maybe," she said. "We'll see." The next Bridge the Gap event was a town hall meeting held at the youth center. Emily and Marcus Hayes had worked tirelessly to plan it, inviting residents to share their concerns and ideas with local officers. The room was packed, every chair taken, and a few people standing along the walls. Emily felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as she stepped to the front of the room. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This is an opportunity for us to listen to each other, to our community. Because change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when we come together." The crowd murmured their agreement, and Emily stepped aside to let the first speaker take the floor. One by one, residents shared their stories. A mother spoke about her son's fear of the police after witnessing an arrest at their apartment complex. A teenager described being stopped and questioned while walking home from school. The stories were raw, emotional, and at times, uncomfortable to hear. Emily glanced around the room, noting the reactions of her fellow officers. Some looked uneasy, others resolute. Daniels sat near the back, his arms crossed, and his expression unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was listening or just waiting for it to be over. When the time came for the officers to respond, Emily was the first to speak. She thanked the residents for their honesty and acknowledged the pain and mistrust that had been laid bare. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can learn from it. And I promise you, we're listening." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Bridge the Gap gained momentum, with new events and initiatives planned almost weekly. Emily threw herself into the work, determined to keep the momentum going. But not everyone was on board. Some of her colleagues viewed the program as a distraction, while others resented the scrutiny it brought to the department. One morning, as Emily grabbed coffee in the break room, she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. "She's just stirring the pot," one officer said, his voice low but full of disdain, "making the rest of us look bad." "Yeah," another replied. "It's not like things were perfect before, but at least people didn't hate us outright." Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She stepped into view, her presence cutting the conversation short. The two officers froze, their expressions a mix of guilt and annoyance. "If you have something to say," Emily said evenly, "say it to my face." The first officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're just saying, Carter, maybe it's time to let this whole thing blow over." Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "People don't trust us because of what they've experienced, not because I'm speaking up about it. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away, it just makes it worse." The officers muttered half-hearted apologies before retreating, leaving Emily alone with her coffee. She leaned against the counter, the weight of their words settling on her. She had expected resistance, but it still stung. Later that day, she found herself in Marcus's office at the youth center, venting her frustrations. "Some of them don't get it," she said. "They think I'm the problem, not the system we're trying to fix." Marcus listened patiently, his calm presence a steadying force. "Change is hard," he said. "It scares people, especially when it forces them to look in the mirror. But you can't let their fears stop you. I'm trying, Emily said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. But some days, it feels like I'm fighting an uphill battle. You are, Marcus said, but you're not fighting it alone. One evening, Emily was working late at the precinct when Daniels approached her desk. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the incident, and his presence caught her off guard. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. Emily hesitated, then nodded. She followed him to an empty conference room, the air thick with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking about that night," Daniels began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And about everything that's happened since. I know I messed up, Carter. I let my assumptions get the better of me." Emily crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, "but I want you to know I'm trying to do better. I've been going to those community events, not because I have to, but because I need to understand. What I did, it wasn't right, and I want to make it right." Emily studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But for the first time, Daniel seemed genuinely remorseful. "It's a start," she said finally. "But words aren't enough, Daniels. You need to show it." "I know," he said. "And I will." As Daniels left, Emily felt a flicker of hope. It was a small step, but it was something. And in a fight as daunting as this one, every small step mattered. Emily Carter had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. So, while Jack Daniels' apology seemed genuine, she remained skeptical. She didn't have the luxury of blind faith, not after what she had been through. Still, his admission had left a faint crack in her armor, one that made her wonder if change was truly possible, even for someone like him. The opportunity to find out came sooner than she expected. A week after their conversation, the captain called a precinct meeting to discuss the next phase of the Bridge the Gap program. Emily had worked tirelessly to expand the initiative, introducing new ideas like ride-alongs for community leaders and workshops to help officers better understand cultural differences. But what she didn't expect was the captain's announcement. "Officer Daniels will be joining the planning committee," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He's expressed interest in being part of this program, and I think it's a good opportunity for him to grow." Emily's stomach tightened. Sitting across the room, Daniels avoided her gaze, but there was no mistaking the tension that rippled through the room. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some officers exchanged skeptical glances, while others simply nodded, their expressions neutral. After the meeting, Daniels approached her cautiously. "I didn't ask for this," he said quickly, as if anticipating her reaction. "But I'm not backing out either. I meant what I said. I want to do better." Emily studied him for a moment. He seemed earnest, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down completely. "This isn't about you or me," she said. "It's about the community. If you're serious about this, prove it." The next planning session was awkward at best. The committee, which included a mix of officers and community leaders, met in a conference room at the youth center. Marcus Hayes was there, as always, his calm presence a steadying force for Emily. Daniels, however, looked like a fish out of water, fidgeting with a pen and occasionally clearing his throat. "Let's focus on the next event," Marcus said, breaking the silence. "We've got the neighborhood patrol walk next weekend. It's a chance for officers to walk the streets with residents and hear their concerns directly." Emily nodded. "We need to make sure we pair officers with community leaders who can guide them. It's not just about being present, it's about listening." Daniels shifted in his seat. "What happens if, what if people don't want to talk to us?" The room fell silent. It was an honest question, one that underscored the fragile trust between law enforcement and the community. Marcus spoke first. "Then you keep showing up," he said. "Trust isn't built overnight. It's earned, one step at a time." Daniels nodded, though his uncertainty lingered. Emily felt a small pang of empathy. She knew how hard it was to confront your own mistakes, to face the consequences of your actions. Maybe Daniels deserved a chance to prove himself. The day of the patrol walk was brisk but sunny, the kind of fall morning that hinted at winter's approach. Officers and community leaders gathered at the youth center before heading out in pairs. Emily was assigned to a route with Marcus, while Daniels was paired with a local pastor named Reverend Thomas. The walk started quietly. Emily and Marcus stopped to chat with residents on their porches, listening to their concerns about safety and the need for more visible patrols. The conversations were productive, but there was an underlying tension that Emily couldn't ignore. For many residents, seeing uniformed officers walking their streets brought up complicated emotions. As they rounded a corner, Emily spotted Daniels and Reverend Thomas talking to a group of teenagers near a basketball court. The boys were cautious at first, their body language stiff, but Reverend Thomas's easy demeanor seemed to put them at ease. Daniels hung back, listening more than he spoke. Later, back at the youth center, Emily found Daniels sitting on a bench outside, his expression thoughtful. "How'd it go?" she asked, sitting beside him. Daniels hesitated. "It was eye-opening," he admitted. "One of the kids said he never thought he'd see an officer walking his block just to talk. It made me realize how much work we've got to do." Emily nodded. "It's a start, and sometimes that's enough." Daniels glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're not as scary as I thought you'd be." Emily snorted. "Don't get used to it." Over the next few weeks, Emily and Daniels found themselves working together more often. It wasn't always easy. They still had their differences, and their conversations sometimes veered into tense territory. But slowly, they began to find common ground. One evening, after a long day of meetings and patrols, they sat in the precinct's break room, nursing cups of coffee. Daniels broke the silence first. "You know," he said, "I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I started seeing people as problems to solve instead of people to protect." Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. "What changed?" He shrugged. "You did. That night, it forced me to look at myself in a way I hadn't before, and I didn't like what I saw." Emily didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "It's not about where you start, Daniels. It's about where you go from here." Their partnership began to shift the dynamics at the precinct. Other officers, seeing Daniels' efforts to change, started taking the Bridge the Gap program more seriously. Emily noticed more participation at events, more willingness to engage with the community. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress. One day, Marcus pulled Emily aside after a meeting. "You've got something good here," he said. "You and Daniels, you're showing people that change is possible. Keep at it." Emily smiled. "Thanks, Marcus, but this is just the beginning." "I know," he said, "and that's what makes it exciting." As Emily drove home that night, she thought about everything that had happened since that fateful night in the parking lot. The road had been rocky, and there were still plenty of challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, and a few late arrivals forced to stand along the back wall. The air buzzed with tension, the kind of energy that comes when lives and reputations are on the line. Emily Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked composed, but inside, her stomach churned with nerves. Jack Daniels sat at the defendant's table across the room, flanked by his lawyer. He looked different than he had in the months since the incident, less defensive, more introspective. Emily wondered if the weight of the case and the introspection he claimed to have embraced had finally cracked through the walls he'd built around himself. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the proceedings began. The first few hours were dedicated to opening statements and witness testimony. Marcus Hayes testified about the importance of the Bridge the Gap program and the impact the incident had on the community. Reverend Thomas spoke about Daniel's efforts to make amends, his words measured and fair. But the most powerful testimony came from Marcus Johnson, the teenager whose video of the incident had gone viral. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, Marcus looked both nervous and determined as he took the stand. "I was scared," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We were just hanging out after a basketball game, but when the officer came over, it felt like we were guilty just for being there. Then Officer Carter showed up, and I thought maybe things would calm down. But when she got arrested, it made me feel like we didn't matter." Emily's chest tightened as she listened. It wasn't the first time she'd heard Marcus's story, but hearing it in this setting, with so many eyes on him, made it all the more poignant. She glanced at Daniels, whose expression was unreadable, though his hands clenched tightly in his lap. When it was Emily's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and stepped up to the stand. She recounted the events of that night with precision, her voice steady even as the memories threatened to overwhelm her. She spoke not just about the incident itself, but about the larger implications, the trust that had been broken, the biases that had surfaced, and the importance of holding each other accountable. "This isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "It's about the system we're a part of, a system that needs to do better." When Daniels took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. His lawyer guided him through his testimony, asking about his perspective that night and the steps he had taken since. "I made assumptions that I shouldn't have," Daniels admitted. His voice was quiet but firm. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and it led to actions I deeply regret. I can't take back what I did, but I'm trying to be better, not just for myself, but for the people I serve." The prosecutor didn't go easy on him, pressing him on his actions and motivations. But Daniels didn't deflect or evade. He admitted his mistakes, owning up to his failure to recognize Emily as a fellow officer, and, more importantly, as a person who deserved the same respect he expected from others. By the end of his testimony, the courtroom felt different. The tension was still there, but it was laced with something else, a sense of possibility, a sliver of hope. After a short recess, the judge delivered her ruling. Daniels was found guilty of misconduct and ordered to undergo mandatory bias training, community service, and a 6-month unpaid suspension. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it was a clear statement that his actions were unacceptable. As the judge concluded, she turned her gaze to Daniels. "Mr. Daniels, accountability is the first step toward redemption. I hope you use this time to reflect and grow." Daniels nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, Your Honor." Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited, cameras flashing as Emily stepped out onto the steps. Marcus Hayes stood beside her, offering quiet support. A reporter called out, "Officer Carter, do you think this ruling will change anything?" Emily paused, her mind racing with everything that had led to this moment. She thought about Marcus Johnson's bravery, Daniel's efforts to make amends, and the small but meaningful changes she had seen in her precinct. "I hope so," she said finally, her voice clear. "But change doesn't come from one case. It comes from all of us recognizing the problem and doing the work to fix it." In the days that followed, the courtroom ruling sparked a wave of conversation within the precinct. Some officers grumbled about Daniel's punishment, while others saw it as a necessary step toward accountability. Emily, for her part, focused on the future. She continued to lead the Bridge the Gap program, organizing events and workshops that brought officers and residents together in ways that felt authentic and meaningful. One afternoon, Daniels approached her desk. He looked nervous, his usual bravado replaced with something quieter. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for not giving up. On me. On any of this. Emily looked at him, surprised. I wasn't doing it for you, she said honestly. But if it helped, then good. Daniels nodded. I've got a long way to go. But I'm trying. Emily smiled faintly. That's all anyone can ask. Later that evening, as Emily walked through her neighborhood, she noticed something different. People smiled at her as she passed, nodding in recognition. A group of kids playing basketball waved, their shouts echoing in the crisp evening air. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged not just as an officer, but as a part of the community. Her journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still walls to break down and bridges to build. But as she stood there, watching the kids laugh and play, she felt a quiet sense of hope. It wasn't about being perfect or fixing everything at once. It was about showing up every day and doing the work. The morning after the court ruling, Emily Carter walked into the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. The air was still tense, but something had shifted. Conversations were quieter, glances less judgmental. Even the officers who had been critical of her seemed subdued, as if the weight of the case had forced them to reflect. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. Emily headed straight to her desk, determined to focus on the Bridge the Gap program. There was still so much to do, and now, more than ever, she felt the urgency of the work. She was halfway through drafting an agenda for the next community meeting when Tom Miller appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Morning," he said, placing one on her desk. "You look energized." Emily chuckled. "Let's call it cautiously optimistic." Tom nodded, pulling up a chair. "The court ruling, how are you feeling about it?" "It's fair," Emily said. "Daniels took responsibility, and he's willing to put in the work. That's more than I can say for some people." Tom sighed. "Change is hard for everyone. But you've opened a door, Emily. People are starting to see things differently, even if they won't admit it." Emily appreciated his support, but she wasn't naive. The system she was fighting to improve was deeply ingrained, its flaws protected by decades of tradition and resistance. Still, small victories mattered, and she wasn't about to lose sight of that. The ripple effects of the court ruling began to show in subtle ways. Officers who had been indifferent to the Bridge the Gap program started showing up to events, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine interest. Daniels, now suspended and stripped of his authority, became a regular at the youth center, volunteering his time to mentor kids and participate in discussions about bias and accountability. At first, Emily watched his efforts with skepticism, but over time, she began to see a genuine shift in him. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was listening, learning, and slowly earning the trust of the people he had once alienated. One afternoon, during a community cleanup event, Emily found herself working alongside Daniels. They were painting over graffiti on a brick wall near the park, the rhythmic scrape of their brushes filling the silence between them. "You don't have to be here," Emily said finally, breaking the quiet. Daniels glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but I want to be." Emily nodded, her movement steady. "It's not easy, you know. Earning trust, it takes time." "I know," Daniels said, "but I'm willing to put in the time. I need to." They worked in silence for a while longer, the tension between them easing into something closer to mutual respect. For Emily, it was a reminder that change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, consistent steps that added up over time. The success of Bridge the Gap began to draw attention from other precincts. Emily received emails from officers in neighboring boroughs asking about the program and how they could implement something similar. Community leaders reached out to express their gratitude, sharing stories of residents who felt heard for the first time in years. But not everyone was supportive. A vocal minority within the precinct continued to resist the changes, viewing the program as a distraction from real police work. Emily overheard their complaints in the break room. their words laced with bitterness and resentment. "All this touchy-feely stuff," one officer muttered. "What's it actually accomplishing?" Emily, who had been pouring herself a cup of coffee, turned to face them. "It's accomplishing trust," she said, her voice calm but firm, "and that trust is what makes real police work possible." The room fell silent, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. Emily didn't wait for a response. She picked up her coffee and walked out, her head held high. At the youth center, Marcus Hayes continued to be a source of encouragement and wisdom. He had seen the ups and downs of community work for decades, and his steady presence was a grounding force for Emily. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emily sat in Marcus's cluttered office, sipping a cup of tea. "Some days, it feels like we're making progress," she said. "Other days, it feels like we're just spinning our wheels." "That's the nature of this work," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. "But don't underestimate the impact you're having. Every conversation, every connection, it matters." Emily nodded, his words sinking in. "I just hope it's enough." "It is," Marcus said firmly, "because you're not just changing minds, you're changing hearts, and that's where real change starts." The next community event was a ride-along program, where residents were invited to spend a day shadowing officers to see their work firsthand. Emily paired up with a young woman named Jasmine, who had been one of the most vocal critics of the police at previous town halls. At first, Jasmine was guarded, her questions pointed, and her tone skeptical. But as the day went on, she began to open up, sharing her own experiences and listening to Emily's perspective. "I never thought I'd say this," Jasmine said as they wrapped up the ride-along. "But this program, it's actually making a difference." Emily smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. "That's the idea." The ripple effects extended beyond the precinct and the community. Marcus Johnson, the teenager who had testified in court, started volunteering at the youth center, mentoring younger kids and sharing his story. Reverend Thomas expanded his outreach efforts, organizing monthly forums to keep the dialogue going. And Daniels, to Emily's surprise, became one of the program's most dedicated advocates. He spoke at events, participated in workshops, and even helped train new recruits on the importance of empathy and cultural awareness. One evening, after a particularly successful town hall, Daniels approached Emily. "You know," he said, "when this all started, I thought I'd lost everything. But now, I think I've found something better." Emily nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. "That's what change feels like." As Emily walked home that night, the city felt different. The challenges hadn't disappeared, and the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of momentum, a belief that the small steps they were taking were building towards something bigger. She thought about Marcus's words, about changing hearts and minds, and she realized he was right. Change wasn't about quick fixes or sweeping reforms. It was about showing up day after day and doing the work. As she turned the corner to her apartment, a group of kids playing basketball waved at her, their laughter ringing out into the cool night air. Emily waved back, a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was enough to keep her going. Emily Carter arrived at the precinct early, her thoughts already consumed by the next phase of the Bridge the Gap program. The initiative had gained traction, attracting attention from precincts across the city and even catching the eye of local government officials. But with recognition came growing pains and scrutiny. Captain Howard had called a meeting to discuss expanding the program citywide. Emily entered the conference room to find her colleagues already seated, some scrolling through their phones, others chatting in low voices. Jack Daniels sat near the corner, his posture more relaxed than Emily had ever seen it, a sign of the personal growth he'd undergone. "Good morning," Captain Howard began, his tone brisk. "We've seen positive results from Bridge the Gap, and City Hall wants us to present a proposal for implementing it across all precincts. This is a huge opportunity, but it's also a challenge. We need to show that this program works not just here, but everywhere. The room buzzed with a mix of excitement and apprehension. For Emily, the prospect of expanding the program was both exhilarating and daunting. She knew how much work it had taken to get this far, and scaling up would mean facing even more resistance from those who were hesitant or outright opposed to change. Howard gestured toward Emily. "Officer Carter, you've been the driving force behind this. I'd like you to lead the presentation." Emily nodded, masking the flicker of nerves she felt. "I'll get started on it right away." As the meeting wrapped up, Daniels caught up with her in the hallway. "You're going to do great," he said, his tone earnest. "This is your thing. Nobody knows it better than you." Emily appreciated the support, but couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility. "Thanks, Daniels. Let's just hope the rest of the city is as ready for this as we are." Over the next few weeks, Emily worked tirelessly to prepare for the presentation. She pored over data, compiled success stories, and consulted with Marcus Hayes and other community leaders to ensure the proposal was as comprehensive as possible. But not everyone was on board. A few officers voiced concerns about the workload, claiming the program took resources away from traditional policing. Others questioned whether the success in their precinct could be replicated elsewhere. One afternoon, while reviewing her notes in the break room, Emily overheard a familiar voice. "This program's a nice idea, but it's not realistic," an officer said. "It's just going to fall apart once they try to scale it." Emily turned to see two officers standing by the coffee machine. Their conversation wasn't meant for her, but she couldn't let it slide. "If you think it's not realistic," she said, her voice calm but firm, "maybe you should come to the next event and see for yourself." The officers looked startled, one of them stammering a half-hearted excuse. Emily didn't wait for a response. She picked up her notes and left, her resolve hardening. Doubts like theirs were exactly why this program was needed. The day of the presentation arrived, and Emily stood in a conference room at City Hall, flanked by Captain Howard, Marcus Hayes, and a few other key supporters of the program. The room was filled with city officials, community leaders, and representatives from precincts across the boroughs. Emily took a deep breath as she stepped to the podium. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves humming beneath the surface. "Bridge the Gap isn't just a program, it's a commitment, a way to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve." She outlined the program's goals, shared stories of its impact, and presented data that showed reductions in complaints and improvements in community engagement. But she didn't shy away from the challenges, acknowledging the resistance they had faced and the work that still needed to be done. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Emily stepped back, her heart pounding, as relief and pride washed over her. After the presentation, several officials approached her to express their support. One of them, a councilwoman named Elaine Porter, shook her hand firmly. "This is exactly what our city needs," she said. "You've done something incredible here, Officer Carter." Back at the precinct, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The presentation had been a success, but the real work was just beginning. Expanding the program would require more resources, more buy-in, and more patience than ever before. As Emily and Marcus debriefed over coffee at the youth center, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've done something big, Emily, but don't lose sight of what makes this work: relationships. Programs come and go, but the connections you've built are what will keep this alive." Emily nodded, his words resonating deeply. "You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the logistics, but at the end of the day, it's about people." The ripple effects of the presentation began to show almost immediately. Precincts from other boroughs reached out for guidance on implementing similar programs. Community leaders who had been skeptical of the police started engaging in dialogue, offering their perspectives and ideas. But with the momentum came new challenges. Critics emerged, questioning the program's sustainability and its focus on relationship building over traditional enforcement. Emily found herself fielding tough questions from both sides, balancing the demands of law enforcement with the needs of the community. One evening, as she was leaving the precinct, she ran into Daniels in the parking lot. He looked tired, but determined. "You've got a lot on your plate," he said, falling into step beside her. Emily smiled wryly. "Is it that obvious?" Daniels chuckled. "A little, but you're handling it better than I would." They walked in silence for a moment before Daniels spoke again. "I wanted to say thanks for giving me a chance to be part of this. I know I didn't make it easy." Emily stopped and turned to face him. "You've earned your place, Daniels, and I'm glad you're here." The next Bridge the Gap event was a block party designed to bring officers and residents together in a casual, welcoming setting. Emily walked through the crowd, marveling at the energy and connection she saw around her. Officers played basketball with kids, parents chatted with community leaders, and even the skeptics seemed to let their guard down. As the sun set and the crowd began to thin, Emily stood with Marcus, watching the last of the families pack up. "You've built something special," Marcus said, "but don't forget to take care of yourself, too. This kind of work can take a toll." Emily smiled, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. "I'll try." As she walked home, Emily reflected on how far they had come. The road ahead was still long, but the foundation they had built felt solid. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel proud, not just of the program, but of the people who had made it possible. They weren't just building a program, they were building a future, and that was something worth fighting for. The evening was quiet as Emily Carter sat on the steps outside her apartment, a mug of tea warming her hands against the crisp autumn air. She looked out over the bustling street, where the faint sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from open windows. The block party earlier that week had been a triumph, and the Bridge the Gap program was gaining recognition beyond anything she had imagined. But tonight, for the first time in months, Emily allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Marcus Hayes. "Marcus, proud of you, Emily. This is only the beginning." Emily smiled. Marcus had been a pillar of strength throughout this journey, his wisdom and steady encouragement a guiding force. She set her phone aside and let her thoughts wander back to everything that had led to this moment. It had started with chaos. That night in the parking lot felt like a lifetime ago, yet its impact reverberated through every decision Emily had made since. She thought about the fear in the teenager's eyes, the cold metal of the squad car's hood against her cheek, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal she had felt when one of her own had treated her like a stranger. But out of that chaos had come something unexpected: kindness. From Marcus Hayes and the youth center staff who had embraced her vision, to Marcus Johnson and Reverend Thomas, who had stood by her in the courtroom. Even Jack Daniels, in his own imperfect way, had become a symbol of growth and the potential for change. Each of these moments, small on their own, had built into something larger, a movement, a bridge, a chance to rebuild trust where it had been shattered. The next morning, Emily walked into the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. The ripple effects of the program were still unfolding, and there was work to be done. She was greeted with a mix of nods and smiles from her colleagues, a stark contrast to the tension that had once greeted her every morning. Tom Miller intercepted her at her desk, holding a box of donuts. "Figured you could use some fuel," he said, grinning. Emily laughed. "Thanks, but I'm starting to think you just use donuts as an excuse to hang out." "Can't a guy just be thoughtful?" Tom replied, feigning innocence. As they settled into a conversation about the next community event, Daniels walked in, carrying a stack of papers. He looked more at ease than Emily had ever seen him, his usual tension replaced with quiet determination. "Morning," he said, placing the papers on her desk. These are the notes from last week's event. Thought you might need them. Emily raised an eyebrow. You're awfully organized these days. Daniels smirked. Don't get used to it. Despite their banter, Emily couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Daniels had come a long way, and his transformation was proof that people could change if they were willing to put in the effort. Later that afternoon, Emily attended a meeting at the youth center. Marcus Hayes had gathered a group of community leaders to discuss the future of the program and its potential expansion. The room buzzed with ideas and energy, but as the meeting progressed, Emily noticed Marcus watching her with a thoughtful expression. After the meeting, he pulled her aside. "You've done something incredible here," he said, "but I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too." Emily tilted her head. "I'm fine, Marcus, really." "You're more than fine," he said with a grin. "But this kind of work can take a toll. Remember to lean on the people around you. You don't have to carry it all alone." His words stayed with her as she walked home that evening. He was right, of course. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself, trying to fix everything on her own. But this journey had taught her something she hadn't fully realized until now. Resilience wasn't about standing alone. It was about leaning into the kindness of others, about letting them carry you when the weight became too much. The final Bridge the Gap event of the year was a community dinner held in the precinct's parking lot. Long tables were set up under strings of lights, and the smell of grilled food wafted through the air. Officers and residents mingled, sharing stories and laughter in a way that had once felt impossible. As Emily walked through the crowd, she was stopped by Marcus Johnson, the teenager whose video had sparked so much change. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Emily smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Marcus. You're the one who had the courage to speak up. That took guts." "Yeah, but you listened," he said, "and that made all the difference." His words warmed her heart, and she realized how far they had all come, not just her, but the entire community. As the evening wound down, Emily found herself sitting with Daniels and Tom at one of the tables. The three of them watched as the last of the guests began to leave, the soft hum of conversation fading into the night. "You did it," Tom said, nudging her shoulder. "You actually built something that works." Emily chuckled. "We did it. All of us." Daniels nodded, his expression serious. "You know, Carter, you're probably the most stubborn person I've ever met. But maybe that's exactly what we needed." Emily laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound that felt like the release of months of tension. "I'll take that as a compliment." Later, as Emily walked home, she reflected on everything they had accomplished. The Bridge the Gap program wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to be done. But it had shown her the power of perseverance, the strength in vulnerability, and the enduring impact of kindness. She thought about Marcus Hayes, Reverend Thomas, Marcus Johnson, and even Daniels. Each of them had played a role in this journey, reminding her that change wasn't about one person. It was about a collective effort, about finding common ground even when it felt impossible. As she reached her apartment, Emily looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered like tiny beacons of light. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she wasn't afraid. She had seen what kindness could do, and she knew it was enough to spark a revolution. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for joining us on this journey through resilience, kindness, and hope. Emily's story reminds us that even in the face of challenges, small acts of courage and connection can create lasting change. If this story inspired you or made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. And for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Together, let's continue building bridges and sharing hope, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.